you very much. Thank you. Quite an introduction, so thank you for having me, and I'd like to say thanks to the organisers as well for a fantastic lecture series that you've produced. It's amazing, so thank you. I will speak as slowly as possible because I'm from the north of England. I'm from Manchester, so my pronunciation of words might be slightly strange, so do forgive me. And I'm also very nervous. So this is kind of overwhelming for me because I'm a class teacher, I'm not a lecturer. So, but thank you, and keep smiling and nodding, and then just encouragement, gentle encouragement. So, so where are we going to start today? Well, I'm starting with a recently published paper. I'm really interested in kind of the culture of science and how science is cultural rather than this objective enterprise and endeavour that it seems to kind of promulgate, and it has done for hundreds of years. So my specific interest is in kind of understanding non-human animals in experiments. And so because I don't like to go out much, but I prefer to stay in historical archives on my own, I came across quite a lot of literature about kind of menstruation or periods, and how actually the construction of kind of menstruation is a historical kind of enterprise, which has been written and narratived by scientists, particularly since the mid-20th century. And most importantly, a lot of the scientists, the reproductive scientists that explored menstruation, they also kind of used non-human animals. So female human bodies intersected and transmuted with female non-human bodies. And that's what we're going to explore today. So excuse my meme, I like a good meme, yeah, so bear with me. So I would like to start with a quote by a reproductive scientist called Leon Israel from 1936. And he was talking about the idea of PMT, premenstrual tension. And I'm sure most of us in this room do get some sort of premenstrual tension. I don't know, what do you reckon? Yeah, and at the time, this is a quote from Leon Israel, and he says, "The illness may mimic as an oncoming mental disease. The forbearance of the patient's family is taxed beyond endurance by her unnatural and extreme annoyance with trifles. Unreasonable emotional outbursts and causeless crying spells." This is my favourite, this next bit. "Nymphomania is an arresting symptom and commands the deepest sympathy." So yeah, so can women have a sex drive? Can they be considered nymphomaniacs? Well, in Leon Israel's case, no, it's an arresting symptom. We need to kind of evoke sympathy when women have PMT. My mouth's drying up, do bear with me. So I'd like to start with Leon Israel, and we'll return to him towards the end of the session, because that quote is quite pertinent and relevant to what is about to follow. And what is about to follow is this idea of gender and how scientific constructions of gender feed into discourses, so feed into kind of narratives on menstruation and non-human animals as well. And that's what we're going to be looking at. So please feel free to chip in. If you want to shout something at me nicely, then please feel free if you've got any ideas, because I like to make it as interactive as possible. But this is what we're going to be focusing on today. We're going to identify and discuss how animal-dependent endocrinological, I'm nervous, bear with me, endocrinological experiments contributed to the construction of gender dualisms. So endocrinology is the study of hormones. So we're going to be identifying and discussing how this study of hormones kind of fed into kind of cultural constructions of gender. And then we're going to analyse that and look at how they inform the understanding of menstruation with a specific focus, if I get that far, on PMT. So in women and, interestingly, female non-human animals as well. And then, if I make it towards the end, we're going to discuss how women's and non-human animals' bodily transmutations, so how they kind of intersected, their bodies materially and culturally intersected in menstrual science. And we're going to use Carol J. Adams's construct or concept and theory of the absent referent. Have we all heard of the absent referent by Carol J. Adams? Yeah, she's pretty cool, yeah? So we're going to tie it together with the theory by Carol J. Adams. So, my memes again. What do you reckon? So these are kind of, these aren't historical. I kind of typed this in the internet when I was at work the other week, as you do. Yeah, so we can see here actually, my favourite one is the cat at the end there. When a woman has a menstruation. A woman on a normal day, the domestic dog, and during menstruation. When she's on her period and hears you breathing, and then the tigers as well. So women on their period. So you can see actually how non-human animals, domesticated and wild non-human animals, are still used as cultural connotations or cultural constructions to explain women's kind of periods, yeah, or their experience on their period, yeah. I don't know if you agree with that. We can discuss that later. It'll be interesting. But yeah, and it's usually angry cats. What's going on there? Angry dogs. So yeah, so these are kind of memes, is that right? Memes from today, yeah? So if you compare to kind of with Leon Israel, who spoke about women when they have PMT, how it's a mental disease, you can see a historical kind of trajectory where actually to where we are today. And it's something that I'd like to kind of discuss with you because I'm very much stuck, not completely, it's very much stuck in the past, yeah? So it'd be interesting to see your contemporary kind of interpretations of this as well. So, which brings us to, nicely, Carol J. Adams and her idea of the absent referent. And I find it quite abstract to explain and understand, actually, because it's something very simple, but actually when you try to explain it, it's kind of quite complex. So I'll do my best here. So we know who Carol J. Adams is. She's a US feminist animal studies scholar, and she's most famous for her book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. And this is where she kind of coined the term the absent referent. So Carol J. Adams said, for her, the absent referent is about meat eating and the consumption of dead animals. So she says meat eating and sexual violence towards women kind of is the key to understanding the absent referent. So the intersections, again, between the woman and the animal, or women and animals, rather. And she says, actually, this is most prominent in Western societies. There's a link between the eating of dead animals and living in a patriarchal society. Animals, in that case, are the absent referent, yeah? So they're the referent, it's who we refer to, but their absence is presented in meat because they're not living, and I'll explain that in a moment a bit further. So animals are the absent referent in meat eating, dairy, and egg production, because they disappear from our consciousness to become food. Do we have any vegans here today? Oh, yeah! Good. So animals are the absent referent. They disappear from our consciousness to become the food that we eat. So the reference then, as I was saying, are non-human animals. And their absence manifests in three ways. This is according to Carol J. Adams. So literally, the animal is dead, but also they're absent in body because we cut them up and we rename their body parts. So for instance, a pig becomes pork. So 3, conceptually they disappear. So it's using non-human oppression as a metaphor for describing human experiences. And Carol J. Adams talks about domestic abuse specifically, and how domestic abuse survivors, particularly women, say how they felt like a piece of meat. So conceptually, semiotically, metaphorically. So women are absent reference too. So it's not just animals in Western societies that are absent reference, but women are too. And it's about the structures of patriarchy, which enable this denial of what women want to do with their lives. And that's why they are the absent referent. And for example, I've put here reproductive choice. So if we look to the US at the moment, and we look at kind of the abortion debates and the abortion laws and policies that are being put in place, is quite frightening. So women too are absent reference, for example, with reproductive choice. But also through language as well, to analogize given situations. So women become the absent referent through language. So the dairy industry used to call, for instance, the way they inseminated cows, the rape rack, but also the Iron Maiden as well, how they held the cows as well in the dairy industry. They have recently, the dairy industry, changed their terminology, interestingly enough. So for Carol J. Adams, women and animals become overlapping absent reference in a culture of patriarchy and masculine dominance. So that's it's simple but complex, yeah? So just to explain this further, in terms of to illustrate theoretically the absent referent, and something that I've done with menstruation, is illustrate it using the theory of the cycle of objectification, fragmentation, and consumption. So you can really illustrate the absent reference through this cycle. So I've put Donald Trump there. That's another meme. Yeah. So objectification is part of the cycle. This is the oppressor constructs another living being as an object. So if you just look at the Trump quotes there, I don't think I'll say them. Yeah? So fragmentation as well. The bodies are literally and metaphorically dismembered. And they're represented as parts greater to their whole. So if you look at kind of depictions of women, particularly celebrity women, it's about kind of their, parts of their body. I'm thinking of Pamela Anderson, but then she's I don't know, that's kind of years ago when I was probably your age. But yeah, and also consumption as well. The referent only exists to be literally or metaphorically consumed. So the absent referent relates to relates to women and animals, and how they're materially and through language, culturally, kind of made absent. And whether for Carol J. Adams, that's through meat eating, or for women through forms of sexual violence. And we're illustrating this today through Carol J. Adams' cycle of objectification, fragmentation, and consumption with Donald Trump. Yeah. So that's the theory out the way. I don't like a lot of theory, but hey ho. So what about menstruation then? What about periods? So my argument is that by using kind of Carol J. Adams' theory, it allows for greater theoretical explication and instantiation, so inclusion of the non-human animal or non-human animals and the role they played in the making of menstrual science. So actually it's inclusive. So it's about bringing into history kind of the voice of the representation of non-human animals. Yeah? So they're not just as an aside to say, oh yeah, we did some animal experiments. We're actually bringing them into the center, from the margins to the center. But also it allows us to see how women and animals in menstrual science become overlapping absent reference. So, for instance, in menstrual science, women and animals become overlapping absent reference. They're present and they're absent in this historical development of the science of menstruation through the physical act of the experimentation, the material praxis, the very methodologies of science. So the physical act of experimentation on the animal body and the dependence of the scientific method, this is a bit, on metaphors that rely on the absent referent, which indicate the institutionalization of patriarchal values. That's a lot of words for me. So they become women and animals overlapping absent reference in the material praxis and the cultural descriptions drawn from the wider society into scientific practice, but also vice versa. Yeah, science produces cultural norms and values, and we'll explore that with the evidence later as well. And I just want to add, I think this is a very kind of violent use of kind of non-human animals, animal experimentation. So, you know, I think I'm kind of channeling Dinesh Joseph Wadiwell when he talks about how actually there's a war on animals. We have a very violent relationship with animals, and this has been occurring throughout kind of history. So yeah, so I want to kind of demonstrate the very violent material reality experimentation created for non-human animals themselves. So once again, we're bringing the non-human animal into historical storytelling. And I call it storytelling because it's a story. So yeah, if we can get this PowerPoint working, I do have more memes. Thank you, fantastic. But these are, I promise, these are the last, oh no, I think there's one more. But yeah, so where do we begin then in terms of this exploration, this kind of story we're talking about today of menstrual science? Well, we begin with the study of hormones. I do like a lot of swearing. I do apologise. It's my northerners, my Manchester. But yeah, so where does it begin? It begins with the study of hormones and the discovery of hormones. And I find this really fascinating, and I can point you in the direction of kind of significant literature at the end of the session. But yeah, so where does I call it the menstrual absent referent begin? So once again, I'll just read the duck meme, I won't read the sweary meme. But yeah, so don't waste time arguing with a hormonal woman or women. Ask your girlfriend if she's on her period before getting into an argument. And then what tops it all off, the last bit? Then stroke the back of her neck and ask her to calm down. I think I do that with my dog. Calm down, it's all right, it's all right. So yeah, so once again, we can look at kind of this, where these cultural constructions of women on their periods, they're still present today. So if you can kind of tell me more about this at the end of the session, I'm really interested to see what you think. So yeah, hormones. So kind of creating male and female bodies then. So it all comes down to this kind of gendered binary, how it was kind of invented, so to speak, through the study of hormones, or rather reified, kind of solidified and cemented more, this kind of gendered binary through the study of hormones. So hormones then were first named as such by British physiologists, particularly Ernest Starling in 1905. Yeah, he claimed that hormones are they have a cause and effect relationship in the body. They're chemical messengers carried from one organ in the body to another. So he also Starling and his colleagues kind of legitimated through their discovery of the hormones, or the naming of the hormones, because in the 19th century they were termed internal secretions. I like that one. Yeah, I think that's pretty good. So yeah, so Starling and Edward Schaefer and William Bayliss, they kind of legitimated the essential part hormones played in regulating the body. So they were kind of I'm going to do my Donald Trump impression. They're big guys. They were big guys. Yeah. So, in the hormone area. But yeah, so Schaefer's experiments, so Stalin's colleague, Schaefer's experiments led him to conclude that sexual difference was purely down to hormones rather than the nervous system. Because prior to kind of the early 20th century, with kind of the discussions in the scientific community about internal secretions, sorry, I really like that, internal secretions, yeah. Actually, prior to that, it was more about the nervous system. Whereas if we look at kind of the physiologists of Starling and Schaefer and Bayliss, they spoke about kind of how actually, no, it was down to the hormones, absolutely down to the hormones, that led to kind of sexual difference and the binary classification of male and female, which we have today. So that means that in the early 20th century to the mid-20th century, endocrinologists or reproductive scientists came up with kind of, they named the hormones and they named them according to kind of gender, so male and female hormones. So from the 1910s to the 1920s, animal-dependent laboratory studies based on the study of sex and reproduction was thought to show exclusive female and male sex hormones. And scientists gave these names, of course, and they're names that we're familiar with today still. So females have a female sex hormone that originated in the ovary, estrogen, and males in the testes, androgen. And androgen connoted, so it kind of determined or defined masculinity. And estrogen referred to, let me say this while I'm nervous, I've got to draw, cyclicity. So yeah, I'll just do actions to myself, just go, yeah, Catherine, yeah. It wasn't until the 1930s that endocrinologists were thought to have established a firm connection between estrogen, cyclicity, and femininity. So there was that strong association, that strong definition between the female or male hormones connoting masculinity and or femininity. And I find that really interesting, as you may yourself. And this was kind of, there was kind of an element of contention as well at the time in the 1930s with the classification of this binary classification of male and female hormones. There was a lot of kind of confusion and dissatisfaction with that classification. So many scientists in the 1930s expressed dissatisfaction with this kind of exclusive classification of female and male hormones. And it was actually an article in the journal Nature in 1934 that German gynecologist Bernhard Zondek highlighted a different binary classification of the sex hormones. My apologies if I've not pronounced his name right. So he claimed that male non-human animals actually had female hormones. Oh, I have got another picture. Oh, thank goodness. And this is what he said. He said, curiously enough, as a result of further investigation, it appears that in the urine of the stallion, the male horse also, very large quantities of the estrogenic hormone are eliminated. So, you know, the male horse kind of wheezes out estrogen. I found this mass excretion of the hormone only in the male and not in the female horse. The determination of the hormone content, therefore, makes harmonic recognition of sex possible in the urine of the horse. In this connection, we find the paradox that the male sex is recognised by a high estrogenic hormone content. So basically what this guy's saying is we can't strictly classify females as having female hormones like estrogen and males having male hormones like androgen. He's saying, well, actually, my studies on horses, they actually show the opposite. What are you on about? Didn't quite say it like that though, did he? So he was really kind of disrupting the binary division that scientists were imposing on kind of human bodies in a lot of ways. So yeah, oh gosh, what am I doing? Yeah, so he goes on to say then, these values show that the testes of the horse is the richest tissue, I won't make a joke, known containing estrogenic hormone. According to my analyses, the hormonic content of both the testes of the stallion is more than 500 times as great as that of both ovaries of a sexually mature woman, and about 300 times as great as that of both ovaries of a sexually mature mare. So what is this demonstrating then? What is he saying? Well, he's saying, well, hang on, we can't stick with what scientists are kind of forcing us to believe in terms of this gendered binary classification of hormones. He's saying, no, my studies are showing the opposite, really. But what we're also seeing, if we take kind of Carol J. Adams' theory, is we see these kind of bodily transmutations between the human and non-human animal. Yeah. So we can see how actually humans and non-humans kind of transmute each other in this kind of discourse of hormones. With the horse becoming, with the human becoming the absent referent, and the horse in this case becoming the referent. But, so, as the 1930s progressed, and people were still dissatisfied by this kind of binary classification of the hormones, it was soon found that actually in human bodies too, men contained female sex hormones and women contained male sex hormones as well. And what happened was that it was the discovery of testosterone, I think it was around 1935, with the discovery of testosterone, that really kind of added to this confusion. And a lot of reproductive scientists, a lot of endocrinologists were kind of discussing and debating these kind of sexed hormones and the classification of such. And testosterone kind of added to that confusion a bit more. So Zondek claimed it was a peculiarity of equines, so a peculiarity of horses. But other research followed which helped to evidence the claims made by Zondek. I do apologise for my pronunciation. For instance, British physiologists Vladimir Korenchevsky, Marjorie Dennison and Catherine Hall in 1937 added to kind of Zondek's work and said, well, actually, yeah, we can't have strictly male and female hormones. We can't, it's just, it doesn't work like that. The human body, the animal body, they don't work like that. And what they did to prove this is that they injected testosterone and its ether, so a little bit of propionate, into rats and into female rats. And they analysed the effects this had on several body parts. Can we see the cycle of objectification and fragmentation coming in here? Have a think. So they injected rats with testosterone, female rats, and analysed the effect this had on several body parts and the functions of the rodents. So it's the weight of their ovaries, the uterus, vagina, and effect on their sexual cycle. And what they found out was actually testosterone propionate could not be assigned to a specific sex. It had bisexual properties. And they put forward a reclassification of the hormones. So it wasn't just male and female hormones. They put forward male hormones, female hormones, and bisexual hormones. However, like the work of Zondek, they were dismissed. But they did add that actually this was really important for human bodies. So they claimed experimental results obtained are important from the point of view of human physiology and pathology. So we can see again here the interchangeable bodies of the human and non-human. And just have a think about kind of the use of non-human bodies in this instance in kind of explaining gender. And think back to Carol J. Adams' cycle of objectification, fragmentation and consumption as well. Just have a think. Then we'll discuss it. I like a good discussion. So yeah, however, they were dismissed. Like Zondek, they were dismissed. And actually it went back to kind of understanding hormones as being specifically female and specifically male. So I've called this the persistence of the binary. This does make, I hope so, I hope this makes sense into, we'll get onto the menstruation, the good bit, in a minute. So, yeah. So this persistence of the binary then, the research by Zondek, by Koronchevsky, was dismissed. It was just wrong. And maybe it was because it was on rats, maybe because it was on horses. So instead, reproductive scientists and endocrinologists turn to non-human primates, turn to monkeys, particularly baboons. So the idea of sex hormone or sex hormone exclusivity based on a two-sex model persisted, and I think it's kind of still with us today. I think there's a female athlete, a South African female athlete at the moment, who's being banned from running. Am I right, or something? So there's still that persistence, and this can be demonstrated through an article in 1938. So after Zondek's work and after Koronchevsky et al.'s work. So in 1938, the British Medical Journal, an article entitled "Male Hormones," and it was an anonymous author. But they drew on the work of Sully, Zuckerman and Alan Parks. And we're going to talk about Sully Zuckerman in a moment. What a character. Yeah, so, and I quote, he's basically saying here that actually there are male and female hormones. We've got to have a binary kind of division of the sexes. And this can be demonstrated, this is what this author's saying, through our study of non-human primates. And he quotes, let me get this right, the fur of the Hamadryas baboon changed after castration to that of the female. But prolonged treatment with testosterone propionate led to the gradual change from the greenish brown of the female to the grey of the male. Thank God for that, right? Yeah, so injection of the same substance into a castrated immature rhesus monkey made the animal fiercer and more dominant, and the external genitalia grew appreciably larger. In the female, androgenic substances, that's the male hormone coming back in, inhibit follicular maturation and luteinization. In other words, it prevents ovulation and suppresses menstruation. So if you kind of think about this, what this person's saying in the British Medical Journal is actually, we clearly have male and female hormones that determine our sex. And this can be demonstrated through baboons and through rhesus monkeys. And they like to talk about castration a lot. Yeah, and they like to talk about if you look at the kind of social norms and values in this statement as well, I find that interesting. The kind of the male rhesus monkey becomes fiercer and more dominant. Yeah. So that means that actually non-human primates became the essential kind of non-human animal to use in order to kind of explain gender and sex, but also explain a lot of human behaviour as well. And that still occurs today with primatology and anthropology as well. You probably know more than me. So if we refer back to kind of Carol J. Adams' notion of the absent referent, in this case in terms of hormones once again, we can see that actually non-human primates became the referent to something that was absent, the sexed human body. The monkey became the experimental artifact which helped to entrench sex differences further. And I claim this is kind of like an establishment of a dialectical, or a back and forth really, interplay between the objectified animal and the absent referent. So what I mean by that is there was a dialectic which was material and cultural. So animals became the material object, so that objectification, once again. Their bodies became fragmented. And the interpretations, the consumption, the interpretations bestowed upon the results are priori assumptions, both from the broader cultural milieu. Yeah? Sorry. It's okay. My students are used to me. You're not, sorry. Yeah, from the broader cultural milieu about sex-specific behaviour. For example, the passive female and aggressive, that should say male, forgive me. So if we refer back to kind of that previous quote with the rhesus monkey, with the injection of testosterone, they become fiercer and more dominant. So what I'm saying here is actually the non-human primates became the referent to something that was absent, the sexed human body. And actually it was a dialectic, it was a back and forth kind of motion between the laboratory and between broader cultural understandings as well. And this is kind of really, I really had to put this quote in, because this is really kind of exemplified by a US embryologist, George Corner. His work was kind of well known in the UK at the time as well, so it is relevant. And I just love it, I don't know. See what you think. So he says this: "It is the first fact the Bible mentions about the human race. Male and female created he them. In every nature myth, the animals enter 2 by 2. In the primitive song and story, every jack that cracks his crown has a Jill that tumbles after. Man that is born of woman finds it impossible to think of a race with only one sex, or to imagine other sexes than 2. Nor does the biologist contradict this. Everywhere in nature, he also sees 2 sexes, even in the lowest and simplest of living things, in which it is fanciful to speak of male and female. There is a sexual mating, or at least a process of renewal of life by the mingling of living substance." So you say, well, hang on. Yeah. Or, you can only get male and females, that's it. Enough said. Yeah? And look at the Bible. So yeah, that was a book from George Corner's book, The Hormones in Human Reproduction, from 1947. So it still persisted, yeah? So I was talking about the 1930s, 1920s and 30s, the classification of gendered hormones, right through until 1947 and beyond. Yeah. So, which brings us to, that's a really, I'm going to get a picture like that one day, you know. One day. This brings us to the Simian science of Sully Zuckerman. And he was a South African-born primatologist, or experimentalist, physiologist. I think he went by a lot of names, actually. Yeah. And he was particularly had important roles in British government as well in the mid-20th century, particularly to do with defence and military. So, but he loved his primates. He really loved them, particularly when they were in a zoo. He really liked them then. Yeah? But he kind of explored a lot of kind of baboons and their behaviour, and kind of transposed that into kind of ideas about humans. Even though, rather contradictorily, he said, no, we can't really compare baboon behaviour to human behaviour. But with menstruation, he did. Yeah. So he was a key, Sully Zuckerman was a key figure. I've lost my notes, I've just gone off on one, haven't I? So Sully Zuckerman, he was a key figure in the development of the discipline of endocrinology in Britain. He was a key figure. He's like one of the founders, really. And he led the way in menstrual research in Britain from the 1930s through to the 1950s. He worked with his mate. He worked with his fellow endocrinologist, Alan Parks. And he looked at this is where the link between hormones and menstruation comes in, the investigations into the role of hormones on the menstrual cycle of primates. They liked to look at, particularly Sully Zuckerman, he liked to look at baboons' bottoms a lot. Loved it. There's chapters and chapters in his work. Really good reading for a Friday night. At the bar. No. So he worked with his fellow endocrinologist, Alan Parks, looking at the role of hormones and what they played on the menstrual cycle of primates. And in 1938, they created, I've called it the internationally renowned journal, Endocrinology, which still exists today. And it was this work with Parks, his mate, and his research on the estrous cycle of baboons, which was to propel him into the ranks of world-renowned scientists. Yeah, definitely going to get one of those pictures done one day. So what did he say? His most famous work then was in 1932, and it had many additions in later years, The Social Life of Monkeys and Apes. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at kind of Sully Zuckerman's work in terms of the constructions of kind of non-human behaviour and how this links to kind of human behaviour in a lot of ways. And then that'll eventually lead to our discussions. We will get there. It'll be over soon. To our discussions on menstruation. But I just want to point out, I think it kind of fits by pointing out the kind of social norms and values that were kind of implicit and sometimes explicit in his work. And then that's when we can see the relationship between kind of the vacillation, remember that dialectic, that interplay between the presence and absence, the material practices in the lab, and kind of the cultural constructions of gender, female human bodies and female non-human bodies. So there are links. So he says here, the overt socio-sexual activities of the subhuman primates, and notice the hierarchy, the human-centric hierarchy straight away with that, the subhuman primates are much further removed from those of the lower mammal than from those of man. The male primate is always sexually potent, of course, yeah, while the female also always to some extent receptive, so very passive, yeah, and the nucleus of the societies of monkeys and apes is the family part, consisting, of course, of an overlord and his harem, held together primarily by the interests of the male and his females. So Sully Zuckerman here is saying, actually, no, there's a male dominance hierarchy, and that was his kind of big theory. But I think we should point out here the kind of how he links that he mentions the closeness of that to the kind of human societies as well. And this will kind of tie in. This will make sense, I hope, make sense into the menstruation in a minute. So the cultural norms and values are kind of implicit and explicit in his work as well. But he liked baboons, and he liked their bums, and he liked baboon sex. And he used this a lot to explain kind of female behaviour in terms of especially sexual receptivity, but also remember going back to that classification, that gendered binary, the hormonal classification of the sexes. He drew on that work as much as he contributed to it in order to explain this kind of stuff. So therefore, with all this kind of back and forth, this dialectic, the presence and absence, the material and the cultural, implicit in Sully Zuckerman's work. He was kind of really kind of into, as we know, sex, sexual cycles and menstruation. So despite, throughout his book, most of the time, despite Zuckerman kind of emphasising dissimilarity between non-humans and humans, this was very different for women's physiology, for Zuckerman. So Zuckerman argued that human beings share with monkeys and apes a smooth and uninterrupted sexual and reproductive life. And this is where the theory comes in from the previous slide, with the human dominance hierarchy and the male being dominant. So his theory of dominance hierarchies was a gateway into this new science of the hormones, and Donna Haraway talks about that, behaviour and menstruation. So for him, it allowed for a fuller explanation of specific sexed behaviour. And also, as we saw when we were discussing the gendered hormones, it helped to reinforce dualism, these dualistic assumptions based on supposed biological sex difference. So his work kind of reinforced, it supported the kind of work on hormonal classifications of the sexes as much as it contributed to it. I'll just have a drink. How are we doing for time? We all right? Yeah. So it was really important for Zuckerman to kind of understand, or kind of state rather, that actually female human menstrual cycles there's a similarity with that of non-human primates. So understanding female mammalian cycles and their similarities across species were to him, and I quote, of distinct practical importance. And he says, in approaching the question of homeology, so that's similarity really, it must be remembered that not only man, but the old world primates, so those are kind of the monkeys and apes from Africa primarily, but the old world primates that have been studied have a menstrual cycle. And considerable advances in our knowledge of the menstrual cycle have been made through the study of apes and monkeys. So can we see here the absent referent come into play? And we can talk about this later, because I think we pushed for time. But yeah, so you can see how actually, the sexed female body, human female body, was kind of the absent referent, with the monkey and the ape being the referent. Does that make sense? Yeah? Which brings us back to that lovely quote at the start by Leon Israel with premenstrual tension. So with all this kind of exploration, the kind of use of non-human primates in the mid-20th century to explore kind of the menstrual cycle and the sexual cycle, what kind of arose from this was actually, in the scientific literature, discussions about menstrual disorders. And there's one quote I really want to get to. So I focused here on PMT, and I've called it the paradox of women's animality. And let's see how we go with it. So the 1930s, as we stated, saw an explosion of research into the hormonal basis of kind of the sexual cycle and menstrual cycle. And that means actually discussions about menstrual disorders kind of started to occur as well in the early to mid-20th century. So any deviation from what was considered normal menstruation, so regular bleeding from the uterus in a 28-day cycle, was considered by scientists as being abnormal. So, for instance, Zuckerman, and then our old friend with the quote about the Bible, George Corner, was saying this as well. So these disorders, and I'm not denying there isn't PMT, but we'll get on to it. So these disorders of menstruation were first studied in the laboratory using a variety of animals from rats to monkeys, but of course mainly monkeys, because of their assumed kind of similarities, thanks to Zuckerman, their assumed similarities with the female, the very kind of socially constructed female human body. But the US conducted most of the research in this area, but the work overlapped and had impacts, of course, in Europe as well, and also in clinical treatment. And yes, we are still in Europe. So the first guy to kind of talk about PMT and to name PMT was Robert T. Frank, a US doctor. And he kind of noticed the link between the hormonal changes women's bodies underwent. So the hormones are back again, so there's a thread running through here. Remember that gendered, reified kind of binary classification of the sexes through the hormones, through to the research by Sully, Zuckerman and the menstrual cycle, and now it's feeding into a bit of both ways, but feeding into kind of this idea of menstrual disorders. So he looks at kind of the hormonal changes Frank did, women's bodies underwent during the menstrual cycle, and then negative emotional state, premenstrual tension. So kind of like, it wasn't just physiological, it was psychological as well. So it's the first time kind of recognising or kind of looking at or stating rather by kind of reproductive scientists about kind of women's psychology as well as their physiology, and the two are tied together. So physiological and psychological kind of changes that the female body underwent as a direct result of the continued circulation, remember that, of excessive amount of female sex hormone in the blood, which in labile persons, healthy persons, produces serious symptoms, yeah? And Frank drew on his patients' accounts and comparisons with the sexual cycles of lower mammals. So he kind of, the women's body come into it, and the women's kind of objectified status comes in, because he drew on his patients' accounts. And also comparisons with the sexual cycles of lower mammals. So women and animals had kind of, for him, the same hormonal action, and the release of a specific hormone for estrus was dependent upon the function of the pituitary gland. And this overproduction of the female hormone as a result of this action would result in the human female experiencing PMT. So what I'm trying to say here, that was really poorly written, was actually... so he drew on kind of, made comparisons between kind of human and non-human females to explain PMT through the action of the hormones, yeah? And that linked to kind of looking at women's psychological or emotional state as well. So yeah, one more. That's the last one. Oh, no, it's not. So yeah, so Frank's work then signified a significant turning point in the scientific exploration of women's psychological well-being. So our psychological being became explicitly tied to her menstrual cycle. And a lot of the time, so remember kind of like the idea of cyclicity that I mentioned right back at the start, if you remember, yeah? So the use of the metaphor, so think about the absent referent and metaphors as well. So not just kind of material practices, but metaphors through language. The use of the metaphor of cyclicity and the study of the fluctuations of female hormones were used to explain women's irrational and emotional mind. And if we go back to the quote right at the start with Leon Israel, he added to kind of this. So that was kind of, he came after Frank, and he added to the catalogue of symptoms that women were thought to have during kind of when they had PMT. So yeah, but what I'm trying to kind of emphasise here is this metaphor of cyclicity. The female hormone, estrogen, cyclicity, that's tied to femininity, but also that's tied to that dualistic divide, yeah? And women, or females, are kind of on that underside of the dualistic divide with animals. So I really like that. That's the last one, I promise. So yeah, so women then became experimental animals, so to speak. And Israel was kind of, he treated 7 women with progesterone injections as well as low-dose irradiation to his patients, and 1 with insulin therapy. And of course, all were noted to have improved symptoms. But women were characterised as having, and going back to that metaphor again, a cyclic alteration of the personality. Cheers. Thanks for that. Yeah? So a cyclic alteration of the personality. The metaphor comes into it, tied up with kind of cycles of nature, estrogen, and then the underside of the binary, if that makes sense. And I really want to I'll finish with this, I think. So this kind of states really how PMT was kind of shrouded, or kind of it kind of illustrates the absent referent in terms of women's bodies being present and the animal body being absent. So this is about one of his patients. This is Israel again. Her present illness was of 7 years' duration and entirely cyclic. And the metaphor comes through again. Existing only during the premenstruum and increasing in intensity with the passage of the years. During the major portion of the month, the patient was a quiet, industrious, and mild-mannered woman. But exactly 10 days prior to each menstruation, she changed to an irritable, tensely restless, irascible, and this is my favourite, shrewish creature. And a shrew is actually kind of, they're like a little mouse kind of thing. Gorgeous. But if they're kind of agitated, then they're known to have a particularly sharp bite. So yeah. So think of the memes right at the start with the tigers and the cats. So, and there's another good bit to this as well. So they turn into shrewish creatures. They have headaches, insomnia, nymphomania. I think he likes that, doesn't he? So yeah, and the last symptom was outstanding because this greatly increased libido could not be stifled, and the patient, despite frequent coitus, was forced to masturbate from 15 to 20 times a day. The alteration of personality terminated abruptly at the onset of menstruation. Thank goodness for that. But it was only to reappear again in 20 days. It was difficult for one who had observed the patient during several cycles to reconcile her dual personality. Okay. So I've called this kind of, if we kind of explore that and explicate or analyse this in terms of Carol J. Adams. Yeah, I've called it the paradox of women's animality. Think back to the dualism again, this gender dualism. It demarcates between the sexes, male and female. Female are usually on the underside of the binaries. I call it the underside of the binary with animals. They're othered with animals. So, however, if we look at that quote again, there we go. If we look at that quote again, you can see that there's an emphasis on the unnatural as much as there's an emphasis on the natural there. So what I find kind of interesting is this emphasis on the unnatural, for instance, nymphomania and masturbation, shifts women's bodies away from the animalised other. So everything I've been talking about, yeah. So it actually shifts women's bodies away from the animalised other. So it moves women away from the biological, yet at the same time, their bodies, women's bodies, are constituted, whatever a woman's body is, but women's bodies are constituted as a result of their biology. So I've said this kind of, these discourses, these scientific discourses that came around at the time, during the period, excuse the pun, that was a really good joke for me, so position women in a paradox. Their behaviour was unnatural if it went against gendered expectations. But at the same time, what was considered unnatural, the resultant emotional and behavioural states, was tied to women's, that word again, cyclic nature, hence natural. So they were kind of like in this paradoxical, or a paradox of women's animality. Oh my goodness me. Oh, I must have been rushing when I wrote this slide. So it's kind of women were occupying a liminal space between nature and culture. So, or nature and the social I've put here. They occupied what Turner calls a threshold between human and non-human. Yeah. They confounded scientists' attempt at classification and eluded definition. But this, more importantly, I think, this did not necessarily pave the way to the end of this dualistic thinking. So Victor Turner, once again, kind of talks about how actually liminality, the definition, is frequently likened to death, to being in the womb, to invisibility, to the wilderness. So that liminal space that women are occupying actually they're occupying the animalised other as well, yeah? So, I've stated, ironically, it still recalls I call it the underside of the binary, one which continues to place women and animals together in a subjugated and very violent position as well. So women's menstrual phenomenon evaded traditional scientific classificatory schema and fell between the boundaries of mental illness and physiological bodily responses. Yet they were still deemed as other, their presence in these experiments recalling the animal as the absent reference through the metaphorical indicators. Remember the term shrewish and the cyclicity. So yeah, I think we've come to an end. So you'll be pleased to know. So overall then we can kind of say non-human animals were essential to ground sex difference. Yeah, and if we look at Zuckerman and his experiments, and just to kind of state, Zuckerman's experiments, he observed baboons in captivity at London Zoo. He set up the colony at London Zoo. So it was all wrong, completely wrong, his observations. Forgot to mention that. Yeah. So we can kind of look through, if we take, through the narrative, through the story we've been going through today, the historical story, we can see that actually Zuckerman's experiments on baboons helped to reinforce female humans and non-humans' inferior status in a dualistic hierarchy. And they saw, I would say, I don't know, it's up to you what you think, but this kind of came about as a result of endocrinology. A lot of the time, not all the time, not completely, I nearly ate the microphone, but not all of that, not completely. But yeah, getting excited. So yeah, and in the 1930s, a community of scientists began to form around the study of menstrual disorders as a result of kind of all these endocrinology kind of work. And they shared a common discourse, a particular language of certain practices that evoked animal metaphors to describe women's experiences. And once again, just to reinforce, I like reinforcing a lot, I like repeating myself a lot. It's a northern thing, it's a Manchester thing, repeat ourselves a lot. So once again, it demonstrates the philosophical supposition of dualism present in kind of scientific methodology. But also the kind of, remember the absence and presence, the dialectic between the material and the cultural, but also the kind of imposition of social norms as well. So yeah, which links to, I'll shut up in a minute, which links to Adam's cycle of objectification, fragmentation and consumption. Nearly finished. Yeah. Got it. So in mid-20th century, Britain as well, the reproductive sciences utilised binary classifications in order to transmute the bodies of women and animals. So the binary classification of the hormones really sets the scene, doesn't it, really? So this ensured the continuation of a sexist and speciesist hierarchy, but via a dialectic of absence and presence. And we can explore the cycle of objectification, fragmentation and consumption in a moment, if you like. But thank you very much. You've been a very good audience. Thank you. Thank you for being patient. Thank you.